I don't think, obviously, we're not anywhere close to announcing any type of a framework or an interim agreement.
8 days, that's the window, 8 days before July 1st. And the man Washington sent to Ottawa just went on the record to say the two of us are, in his words, just not anywhere close to any kind of framework or interim deal. Let that sit for a second, because the date he's talking about, July 1st, is the one a lot of headlines are calling a deadline for the entire Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, the whole thing. The deal that touches roughly 3/4 of everything we sell to the world. And here's why I'm starting here today with you. This isn't distant politics. This is the price of the car in your driveway, the cost of the lumber in the house going up down the street, the grocery bill that's already stretched thin. If you live in this country, the next 2 weeks land directly on your kitchen table. Now, the ambassador's line got all the attention. Nowhere close. It sounds grim. It sounds like a country bracing for a wall. But watch what actually happened while that quote was making the rounds, because the contrast is the whole story. 9 days. That's the one number I want you to hold on to for this entire video. Just 9, because 9 days is all it took for Canada to go from a U.S. tariff threat to a brand new federal law sitting on the floor of the House of Commons. Keep that number in your head. It changes how you read everything the ambassador said. This part flew under the radar for most people, so let me lay the ground first. For decades, our trade has been built on a single dependency. According to Statistics Canada, the United States buys roughly 75% of everything we export. 75%. When one customer takes 3/4 of what you make, that customer holds enormous leverage over you. Every tariff, every political mood swing, every offhand comment about a deadline hits your economy directly. That's not a weakness anyone invented. It's the structural reality we've lived with for generations. And it's exactly why a July 1st date attached to CUSMA makes people nervous. The instinct is to assume the worst, that if there's no deal, the whole agreement vanishes and the tariffs come crashing down all at once. That instinct feels logical. It's also wrong. And the gap between what people fear and what the agreement actually says is where this entire story really lives. Because this is the part that got buried in the noise. July 1st is not a cliff. Under the terms of the agreement itself, July 1st, 2026 is the formal 6-year review date, a scheduled checkpoint, not an expiry. If the three countries agree, they can renew CUSMA for another 16 years. If they don't, the deal doesn't disappear. It simply shifts into a series of annual reviews that can run for up to a decade. And any country that genuinely wants out has to give 6 months' notice to leave. So the deadline everyone is bracing for isn't a countdown to midnight. It's a review. The agreement keeps protecting Canadian exporters, whether or not a fresh signature lands on July 1st. I had to read that twice myself because so much of the coverage makes it sound like a bomb with a timer on it. It isn't. And once you sit with that one structural fact, the ambassador's nowhere close comment reads completely differently. Being far from a brand new framework is not the same thing as being on the edge of losing the deal you already have. Those are two very different situations, and they've been quietly blended together into one scary headline. So here's where it gets interesting and where that number 9 starts to matter. If the deadline isn't a cliff, then the real question changes. It stops being, will the deal survive, and becomes, what is Washington actually pushing for here? What's the genuine pressure point underneath all of this? The ambassador didn't spell it out in that interview. He kept it at the level of frameworks and leaders and timelines, but the real answer was sitting in plain sight, tabled in Parliament just days earlier, and almost nobody connected the two stories. Before I show you what that is, you need to understand the threat that forced Canada's hand in the first place, because the nowhere close line wasn't the start of this. It was the middle. Where we left off, a deadline that isn't really a deadline, and an ambassador saying the two sides are nowhere near a new framework. So if the deal isn't collapsing, what is actually being fought over? This is where the real story starts, and it has almost nothing to do with the soundbite that made the headlines. Go back to June 2nd. That's the date that set all of this in motion. The Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, the official trade arm of the American government, released a finding that landed hard. After a formal investigation, it concluded that Canada was not effectively enforcing its ban on importing goods made with forced labor, and it didn't use gentle language. The USTR described Canada as effectively a dumping ground, a backdoor through which goods banned from the United States could slip into North America anyway. I'll be honest with you, my first instinct was to push back hard, but then I checked the record. And here's the uncomfortable part. They're not entirely wrong. Canada has technically banned forced labor imports since July 1st, 2020, as part of our original CUSMA commitments. Technically. In practice, enforcement has been thin, very thin. So when Washington says the rule existed mostly on paper, that's not propaganda. That's a fair hit, and pretending otherwise would insult your intelligence. Now here's where it sharpens. Alongside that finding, the USTR proposed a 10% additional tariff on Canadian goods. 10%. But, and this is the detail almost nobody is leading with, that tariff would not apply to goods that qualify under CUSMA's rules of origin. Read that again. The very agreement Washington keeps threatening to walk away from is the same agreement that shields the majority of our exports from this new tariff. Hold that thought. It becomes the whole game in a few minutes. So that's the threat, a formal finding, harsh language, and a 10% tariff aimed at the gap in our enforcement. Now watch the response and watch the clock. The USTR finding dropped on June 2nd. Canada signaled it would strengthen its forced labor regime on June 3rd, the very next day. And on June 12th, the federal government tabled an entire new piece of legislation, Bill C-35, the Ban on Importing Goods Made with Forced Labor Act. From that next day signal to drafted federal law, 9 days. That's the number from the top of this video, and now you see why it matters. Let me walk you through that chain because the causality is the whole point. Washington didn't just complain, it attached a real financial weapon to the complaint, a 10% tariff aimed precisely where Canada was weakest on enforcement. That turned a diplomatic annoyance into a measurable cost. And Ottawa's answer wasn't to retaliate, and it wasn't to fold, it was to close the gap. Bill C-35 rewrites the rules. It shifts the burden of proof onto importers, lets the Foreign Affairs Minister publish a list of high-risk goods, and hands border officers stronger powers to detain suspect shipments. Canada took the exact criticism Washington made and turned it into draft law within a week and a half. And this is where Carney's central banking background starts to show. This isn't reactive flailing. It's the move of people who read the threat, isolated the legitimate part of it, and removed the justification for the tariff rather than just shouting about the tariff. Take away the reason and you start to take away the leverage. But I promised you, honest balance, so here's the other side, and it matters. Bill C-35 is not law yet. It received first reading on June 12th, and with the House rising for the summer, it almost certainly won't move forward until the fall. So when the ambassador says nowhere close, part of what he may be pointing at is real. A tabled bill is a promise, not a finished mechanism. Washington can fairly say, show me it passed, show me it's enforced. That's a legitimate point, and any honest read has to include it. So now we have the full picture, the pressure, and the response, which sets up the part I find genuinely fascinating, because once you line up the tariff, the carve-out, and the new law side by side, something flips. The story everyone thought was about Canada being cornered starts to look like something else entirely. Okay, now line up the three pieces because this is where the whole story turns. The tariff threat, the carve-out for CUSMA-compliant goods, and a brand new Canadian law built to answer the exact complaint behind the tariff. Put them next to each other, and here's what nobody saw coming. The 10% tariff Washington is dangling does not touch goods that meet CUSMA's rules of origin. So the single best protection a Canadian exporter has against this new tariff is to be firmly inside CUSMA, which means the agreement the U.S. keeps threatening to walk away from is functioning right now as a shield for most of what we sell south. You cannot credibly threaten to blow up the deal and lean on a tariff that the deal itself defuses. Those two pressure tactics quietly cancel each other out. And once you see that, the nowhere close line stops sounding like Canada on the back foot and starts sounding like both sides circling a deal that neither can actually afford to break. Now, I want to be fair here because this cuts both ways. The U.S. position is not just noise. A 10% tariff on the slice of Canadian goods that don't qualify under CUSMA is still a real bite, and not every product clears those rules of origin tests. Whole categories sit in that gap, and Washington's underlying complaint about forced labor enforcement is, as I admitted earlier, partly earned. So this isn't a story where one side holds every card. It's a story where Canada holds a stronger hand than the headlines suggest, but not an unbeatable one. If I told you otherwise, I'd be doing exactly what I criticize others for doing. To really understand where this goes, it helps to step outside Canada for a second and look at how others have played the same board. This forced labor fight isn't unique to us. The United States built its own model years ago with its Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, a rebuttable presumption system that assumes certain goods are tainted unless the importer proves otherwise. The European Union is rolling out its own forced labor regulation that comes into full force in December 2027, and it's actually broader than ours. It targets goods on the market, not just at the border, and Mexico has been moving in the same direction under the same CUSMA pressure. What does that tell us? It tells us Canada isn't being singled out and dragged somewhere strange. It's being pulled into a standard that the U.S., the EU, and Mexico are all converging on at the same time. Bill C-35 isn't Canada caving to Trump. It's Canada catching up to a global baseline it was genuinely behind on east and choosing to do it on its own terms with a made-in-Canada design rather than having terms dictated to it later. That distinction matters because moving early and voluntarily preserves leverage. Moving late and under duress surrenders it. And here's the part that flew completely under the radar. The same week Canada moved on forced labor, the government also wound down an older watchdog office critics had long called toothless that barely registered in the coverage. But it fits the pattern. This isn't a government improvising under fire. It's one cleaning up the weak spots in its own enforcement story before sitting across the table so that when the U.S. points at a gap, the answer is already, we fixed that. So step back and look at the board the way a negotiator would. Washington has a tariff that mostly misses CUSMA protected goods. Canada has a fresh law that removes the strongest justification for that tariff. The deadline isn't a cliff. And the deal both countries keep posturing about is, underneath it all, still quietly doing its job for exporters on both sides of the border. Which brings us back to the ambassador and to the one thing he said that almost everyone skipped past. Buried in all that talk about being nowhere close was a single sentence about who actually decides what happens next. And that sentence is the real headline. Here's the sentence almost everyone walked right past. When the ambassador was pressed on what happens next, he didn't point to himself, and he didn't point to a room full of trade lawyers. He said the next move belongs to the two leaders, that it's now in the hands of the president on one side and the prime minister on the other to set the direction. And then he added a timeline almost no one repeated. A deal could come before July 1st or sometime in July, but in his words, he doesn't expect it to slip into August. He even added to his credit that he's been wrong before and could be wrong again. Sit with what that actually means. The person whose entire job is this relationship is telling us two things at once. One, the real decision has moved up to the leader level, Carney and the president, face to face. And two, despite the gloomy, nowhere close framing, he's still sketching a window of weeks, not years. That is not the language of a relationship falling apart. That's the language of a hard negotiation entering its final, most sensitive stretch, the part where both sides talk tough in public precisely because the real bargaining is happening in private. And now we close the loop on that number I asked you to remember. 9 days. From Canada's June 3rd response signal to a tabled law on June 12th. That speed was never just bureaucratic hustle. It was a message, sent without a single press release shouting about it, that said, we hear the complaint, we've already moved on it, and we're walking into this leader-level conversation with our weakest point already patched. When the president and the prime minister sit down, Canada doesn't arrive with excuses, it arrives with a bill number. So let me translate all of this into what it actually means for you, because that's the part that matters once the cameras leave. If a deal lands in the next few weeks and CUSMA renews, the picture for most Canadian households stays stable. The goods we trade most heavily keep flowing under the protections we already have. But if talks drag and that 10% tariff takes effect on non-CUSMA qualifying goods, the cost doesn't stay in some boardroom. It works its way into the supply chain, into the price of certain imported components, into manufacturing inputs, and eventually into what you pay at the register. The categories most exposed are the ones that can't easily prove they meet rules of origin thresholds. So the single most useful thing to watch over the next few weeks isn't the tone of the headlines. It's one question: does a renewal get signed, and does Bill C-35 keep moving in the fall? Those two things, more than any soundbite, decide whether this touches your budget. Where does it go from here? My honest read: the most likely path over the next 6 to 12 months is a renewed or rolled over CUSMA, paired with Canada quietly tightening enforcement to keep the forced labor issue from ever becoming the lever it nearly became. The leaders will posture right up until the moment they don't, and the structural truth underneath it all won't change. These two economies are too wired together to actually unplug. The U.S. has real leverage. Nobody serious denies that. But Canada walked into this round having already done its homework, and that changes the balance of the conversation more than any single tariff does. So here's the whole thing in one line. The headline said, Canada and the U.S. are nowhere close. The fine print says Canada showed up early, patched its weakest spot in 9 days, and is sheltering most of its exports behind the very deal everyone keeps threatening to tear up. That's not a country getting cornered. That's a country that read the room before the room filled up. And whatever you think of the politics, that kind of preparation is the difference between negotiating from fear and negotiating from position. So here's my question to you, and I genuinely want to know. When you line up the loud headline against the quiet 9-day move underneath it, do you read this as Canada under pressure or Canada quietly setting the terms? Because depending on which one you see, the next 2 weeks are going to look like a very different story. Tell me where you land on this. I read every one of these, and on this one, I really want to know.